Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to today's webinar. The latest innovations that we announced at Edge are going into a bit more detail on all the cool new stuff that we've been working on. I'm Gavin Millard, Vice President of PMM here at Tenable, and we have got a significant amount of you joining us this morning. So I'm just going to give it 30 seconds for people to stream into the Zoom webinar. Whilst we're waiting, the standard rules apply: no fighting, biting, or punching. Also, if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A panel. If you have any problems, please also ask them in the Q&A panel as well. We have one of the lovely people from the marketing team in the US looking out for any issues, and they will jump in and help as required. If it's an audio issue, then you won't be hearing me say any of this, so it'll be irrelevant. But if you have any other issues, please let us know. So with that, let's start off talking about all the great stuff that we announced back at the start of this month at Edge, as I said, going into a little more detail. Now, to preface all of this, really, I wanted to share the way that we have thought about the things that we launched or that we are launching over the next quarter. And it all centers around three key things: see everything, predict what matters, act to address risk. So on see everything, it's all about expanding the visibility that you have across your entire attack surface. Predict what matters is really helping drive decisions on what to remediate and also where you should be assessing next. And then act to address risk is all about the measurements that we put in place to ensure that you are addressing risk in a timely manner, that you are making the decisions that you need to make, and also that we are identifying how well you've been addressing those risks as well. So on the see everything front, one of the biggest things that we announced at Edge is our frictionless assessment of cloud assets. Now, this is a game-changing approach, and I don't often use the phrase game-changing because I think it's overused, but game-changing with how we assess assets in the cloud. Now, if we think about how people assess assets in the cloud today, it's actually really based on the old principles of vulnerability assessment or vulnerability management. You either deploy a scanner to sweep across and assess for vulnerabilities, or you deploy an agent within your golden AMIs, for example. Now, this is very ineffective. First off, sweeping across an environment with a scanner, especially in cloud, you could have a full class A network, and it's very difficult to pinpoint the right assets. Now, we've made that easier in the past by leveraging things like Cloud Trails and the AWS Describe and the other APIs that are available on things like AWS. But in reality, we were using, and like us and all other vendors in this space, we're using old approaches to assess modern infrastructure. And this means that there is a lot of assets within the cloud that aren't being assessed. In fact, our data science and research team did some analysis, and it looks like on average about 20% of the assets discovered in the cloud are actually then go on to be assessed for vulnerabilities. It's very easy to discover assets. It's a lot harder to assess for vulnerabilities. And of course, this leads to a gap in coverage. It leads to a gap in knowledge of where those vulnerabilities reside. And even if an asset is very short-lived, it still is an issue because the short-lived assets spin up and down all the time. And therefore, vulnerabilities that are resident there can be leveraged in an attack. So we took a new clean sheet of paper and said, how would we assess for vulnerabilities in the 21st century on the cloud? And we came up with frictionless assessment. And what that does is it leverages the AWS or cloud native, cloud specific tools that are available to be able to gather an inventory of what the what's running on the EC2 image or instance, and then we pull that back to IO for assessment. So this means that you can assess for vulnerabilities without deploying a single piece of code, no scanners or agents are required. In practice, that means that you set up the frictionless assessment, you point it to your AWS account that you're interested in monitoring, define the tags that you're interested in. And when I say tags, I mean the AWS tags, and then hit the magic button. And we do cloud formation stuff in the background, basically creating an S3 bucket. We configure Amazon's SSM, the system management agent, to collect the information that we require. And then that policy is deployed across all of the EC2 instances. And then we start to stream results back to IO and assess for vulnerabilities. Now, that piece of that rather complex sentence actually takes about 5 seconds to complete from your perspective, and a couple of minutes in the background to work to collect those results. So you can go from a clean Tenable IO instance with nothing in it at all, point it to your AWS infrastructure, and then get results back into that into your IO container in under 5 minutes. Very, very quick. As I say, it uses cloud native tools, so you don't have to ask permission from AWS. You don't have to deploy, a Nessus scanner in the cloud. And then really crucially, what we then do is the SSM agent is continuously identifying as the state changes. So, if a new system or service is spun up, a new asset is spun up, or even a new vulnerability is discovered or disclosed, we then reassess automatically and identify where you are vulnerable. So frictionless assessment of cloud assets is going to change the way that you are assessing for vulnerabilities in the cloud. We're going to start rolling this out next month. That's November. Across the different regions. So it'll be a couple of weeks going across the different regions, but it will be available to all IO customers. And the rollout will be finished within about the 1st or 2nd week of December. So, as your container is enabled, you'll see a little pop-up come up within Pendo that says, you now have frictionless. You set that communication up and bump, you can now assess for vulnerabilities in the cloud without deploying any code or agents. Awesome capability, change the way that you assess for vulnerabilities. So big one there. The next big thing that we announced was the ability to be able to predict where you are exposed without understanding what vulnerabilities are on the system. So today, what we do when we are calculating your asset exposure, basically, how exposed that asset is on the vulnerabilities and the criticality of the asset itself, we make a calculation per asset. We basically say, what's the probability and impact of exploitation of any given vulnerability on that host? We times it by the asset criticality divided by 10, square root it, times it by 1,000. That gives us the asset exposure score. And this is a really accurate view of the level of exposure that you have, because we know all of the vulnerabilities on that asset that we're assessing. We use credentials, we log in, we run all the tests that we need to, fire all the plugins that we need to, and we gather that information. Now, where this doesn't work, though, is where we don't have full visibility of that endpoint. Let's say, for example, you're not leveraging credentials or an agent. Let's say you are doing an uncredentials check. Well, that causes a problem because we don't know all the vulnerabilities that are resident on that system. We only know the vulnerabilities that are outwardly facing, that are on a listening port that we can interrogate and grab a banner. Now, does that pose a risk? 10 years ago, no, because 10 years ago, basically all vulnerabilities were leveraged through communicating directly with the box. It had to have a listening port. So things like IIS vulnerabilities, Apache vulnerabilities, they're really, really popular because that's how you took advantage of, the system. You leveraged a remote code execution vulnerability or, a listening port that had a buffer overflow on it. But times have changed dramatically in the last few years. Nowadays, user interaction vulnerabilities are becoming the most popular vulnerabilities, and you can't see them with uncredentialed checks or if you don't have an agent deployed. So there is a significant amount of risk if you're not leveraging credentials. Now, again, using the data science team and our research team, we did some digging, and it turns out that 40% of the assets that are assessed are generally assessed with credentials. 60% aren't. So that means that 60% of your infrastructure, on average, you only are doing uncredentialed checks. So you don't have perfect visibility of where you're exposed. And now, in reality, we know what vulnerabilities are probably going to be resident on that system that you're scanning without credentials, because we've seen that, a similar asset time and time again. We have a huge data lake, which I'll talk about shortly. We have a huge data lake of similar assets. So in front of me right now, I have an iMac 5K Retina with the latest version of Mac OS on it, standard sets of applications. Even if you didn't run a credential check on this system, you could probably guess what vulnerabilities would be present on here. Now, fortunately, I patch all mine, so there won't be any. But for a general average system within an environment, you would know the types of vulnerabilities that would be resident. So what we do is we take where we know the asset type, but we don't know the vulnerabilities present. We take the average from our data lake of similar asset types, mix that with the detected vulnerabilities of that asset itself. So let's say it's got a listening port on it, like FTP or Apache or something like that. We take the asset features and map them to similar assets. So for example, how many ports are listening? Well, if I've only got 3 ports listening, we'd compare my asset to similar assets in the data lake. Customer behavior. So am I a happy patcher, patching things very, very quickly, or do I take my time about it? Do I focus on the most critical vulnerabilities, or do I take a more broad sweep approach to addressing vulns? And then we run that through a machine learning algorithm, and we create what we call a predicted asset exposure score. So, like, put very simply, what we do if we don't, where we don't know the vulnerabilities that are present, we predict the level of exposure of an asset based on the data lake average and your behavior as a customer. Now, this is really, really important and really pretty cool as well, because what it means we can do is help you decide where you should assess next. In this area here, I've got low levels of potential risk because they're modern asset types, and there's no residual risk there. These assets, though, that we've only done an uncredentialed check on, there's potentially high levels of high level of exposure. Therefore, we should assess those systems first, and we can leverage assessment maturity to ensure that you're rolling out more robust assessment of those asset types. You're improving the accuracy of the exposure score and ensuring that you're identifying vulnerabilities where they're present. Now, to me, this is that vulnerability priority rating is a great way of knowing what you should patch next. This is a great way. This predictive scoring is a great way of knowing what you should assess for next. So speaking of the data lake, it turns out we have a very, very large data lake. We have 20 trillion aspects of threat, vulnerability, and asset data, 20 million threat artifacts that we are leveraging every day to predict all of the make all of our different predictions. So as an example, vulnerability priority rating, as I said, which is the predicting the vulnerabilities likely to be leveraged in an attack. The asset exposure score, predict the exposure score of assets even when overall visibility is low. And then also the overarching cyber exposure score as well, which is an objective measure of cyber risk by leveraging the threat, vulnerability, and business impacts of the assets and vulns discovered. Now, we call this exposure AI. It's all the brains that help make these data-driven decisions. it's the thing that sits there on our platform, analyzing the data lake of 20 trillion aspects of threat, vulnerability and asset information. And it's the thing that powers all of your solutions. So whether you're leveraging SC or whether you're leveraging IO, the decisions that you make are powered by Exposure AI. Now, when we tell you the bad vulnerabilities, though, you need to make a decision. And like when you're addressing the vulnerabilities that are actively being targeted by attackers, inaction isn't an option. You need to make a decision. And your decisions really are remediate or mitigate. Remediate by, for example, patching a vuln, or mitigate by ensuring that a compensating control is in place. And we at Edge announced two key new capabilities: Remediation Maturity and Mitigations. Remediation Maturity measures how effectively you're addressing vulnerabilities through patching and remediation actions, and Mitigations measures measures how effectively you have deployed controls like endpoint detection and response when remediation isn't possible. On the remediation maturity side, it measures the speed and efficiency of remediating vulnerabilities and compares that to external peers and also our best practices as well. And it helps answer 4 key questions. So what is the average remediation time since discovery? So since you ran a scan across the network and identified that you are vulnerable to a particular vulnerability? What's the average remediation time since publication? So this is a really good indicator of where assessment maturity needs to be improved as well. So it takes you time to find a vulnerability before you're actually remediating it. And then what is the remediation coverage? So are you remediating a small percentage or a large percentage of the systems that are vulnerable to attack? And then what is the average number of vulnerabilities per asset as well? And we leverage a VPR here to say, critical, high, medium, and low. And the great thing is we can then compare all of this to your peers as well. So on average, I have 8 critical vulnerabilities per host. Is that good or is that bad? Is that something that's normal, or is that something that's suboptimal? And so leveraging remediation maturity, you get a simple scorecard of how well you're addressing these issues, and really helps you drive decision on where you need to make improvements. For example, here is my scorecard from my own environment. And we can see here that, naughty me, I have a remediation responsiveness grade of F. That is shocking, Mr. Millard. I need to do better. The average remediation time since discovery, you see that I'm actually trailing on critical and high vulnerabilities. It takes me a long time to remediate compared to public services and population. Average remediation time since publication, again, I kind of suck at that as well. Average vulnerabilities per asset, I'm slightly lower than the mean or the average. But my remediation coverage, the amount of vulnerabilities the percentage of vulnerabilities that I'm addressing are below the population. So responsiveness, I'm an F. Remediating coverage, I'm not quite so bad, I'm a D. Now, the key widget on this screen is the recommended actions. It tells you exactly what you should improve on. So you take an average of 65 days since patch publication to remediate vulnerabilities with critical VPR, increase your scan frequency. And by the way, if you click on that, it will take you through to, to create a new scan or to edit an existing scan to discover vulnerabilities sooner and match the industry average. If you think about assessment maturity that we rolled out earlier in the year, that's how well you're identifying vulnerabilities. Remediation maturity is how well you're addressing vulnerabilities. And these two different sides of the same coin help drive improvement to your overall program. If you're good, be great at identifying vulnerabilities, be great at remediating vulnerabilities, and then use the information that we provide to drive improvement through the organization. How is Paris compared to London? Do we see that London is trailing behind Paris when it comes to remediation and assessment? Therefore, we need to, do we accept that, or do we drive improvement there? Is it something that is never going to improve? Or is it something that just by a small investment in time and energy, or by building a better relationship with IT operations, we can actually improve that grade and you know, and catch up with the other areas of the business? So with that, I can take a drink. And we'll move to Q&A on these capabilities that we announced. Just before we do, the NSA rather unusually disclosed 25 vulnerabilities actively being targeted by state-sponsored threat actors over the last few days. And our research team have done a rapid response and are publishing a blog, but they're also doing a webinar tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Definitely worth joining. They're going to go through the top 25 vulnerabilities. It's actually a really interesting list. Those vulnerabilities that have been disclosed, I won't take steal their thunder, but a lot of them are remote access vulnerabilities. So are, you know, things like XIM, Cisco vulnerabilities, Citrix, and a few others, the Pulse Secure SSL vulnerability, but definitely worth joining and understanding the 25 vulnerabilities. What's even better is we have 100% coverage of the 25 vulnerabilities that the NSA announced. Therefore, you know, by joining here, seeing the vulnerabilities that have been disclosed, you can go off, scan your environment, and then see how well you've been identifying and addressing them with assessment maturity and remediation maturity. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and go to Q&A. We've got a few coming through. So Anthony asks, how well does predictive scoring work on legacy assets or non-mainstream assets where agents might not be supported, such as things like mainframes or IoT? That's a great question, Anthony. So I think it goes to how we do it today, right? The way that we do it today is a very rough average of all of your asset types. So we don't differentiate between an IoT device or, let's say, a Windows XP device. So we would say, you know, the average for your environment is 512. Therefore, any asset that we discover that we don't assess would also have that 512 score. Like that is not, you know, that is not good enough. We can improve that accuracy. So what we do is, as I said, like we'll take an IoT device and we would say, okay, well, you know, it's this vendor. Do we have any other other assets in our 20 trillion aspects of threat, vulnerability, and asset information? If we do, then we assign it this value. If we don't, then we assign an average from your container. But you can actually affect this predicted score. You can affect the predicted score by changing the asset criticality. So yeah, as an example, let's say you had a load of IoT devices and we're giving them a predicted score of 400, and you say there's no way that they're 400. I disagree. Great. You can disagree with our prediction, change the ACR, and that will actually affect the overall AES of those devices, you know, bringing that number down or up depending on your perspective. Amin asks, are the recommended actions presented or prioritized in any particular way? Great question, Amin. They're actually based on the impact to the cyber exposure score or the impact to the grade that you have from things like assessment maturity or remediation maturity. So you know, we would prioritize, let's say, on the cyber exposure score side, if you patch this one vulnerability and reduce your cyber exposure score by 500, then that would be the one that's at the top of the list. With assessment maturity and remediation maturity, if it move, what's the biggest move, the biggest bang for the buck that you can get by making improvement? So, for example, on assessment maturity, maybe you've got a whole network that you're not using credentials for. So that would be like the priority number one, like improve your visibility. On the remediation maturity, we take into consideration like the vulnerability priority rating blended with the amount of assets affected. So Donna asks, does the frictionless assessment only work with AWS? What about Azure and Oracle Cloud? So great question. We first are rolling out a frictionless assessment for AWS. And the reason we chose AWS is it's the biggest density of our user base. Most users use AWS. Secondly, Amazon have the SSM agent that is deployed on virtually every EC2 type. So when we designed frictionless, that was the easiest target for us from a coverage perspective, both on the usage of the platform and also the usage of the agent. Now, the actual capability itself, frictionless, is a really clever capability that we're going to be leveraging in other ways. So as an example, with Azure, there is a system manager agent. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head now. I apologize, and we can leverage that by a similar method. So what we'll be doing over time is building out new recipes for these different agent types that we can gather the information from, and then we'll bring them into the same pipeline as the AWS one. It's a game-changing approach, and this really will enable us to leverage frictionless in many different ways. There's like, could we use it on, let's say, a patching agent as an example on more traditional IT. Mr. or Ms. Anonymous asks, will AES work with unsupported software if there's no VPR on some unsupported plugins? So does it take into account that unsupported is more important? So the data scientists are actually working on an approach of adding a VPR element to unsupported. So at the moment, we base it on the known CVEs, irrelevant of whether it's unsupported. But then, one of the problems that you have is as something becomes unsupported, there's no CVEs necessarily assigned to that floor. So what we'll be doing is, let's say Windows XP as an example, I used it earlier, is the VPR of that, a 10? And because it's an unsupported. It's actually slightly more nuanced than that as well, because it comes down to density, the amount of vulnerabilities associated with that asset. Because like if you have one VPR of 10, that doesn't necessarily reflect that the AES will be the top AES compared to another asset that has like lots and lots of 8s. So what we need to do is look at really adjusting the AES based on the unsupported software rather than just the VPR. David Patterson asks, how would this function in a zero trust environment? David, I'm assuming you're referring to frictionless assessment. With regards to the access we require, it's the keys for the AWS infrastructure, which a lot of our customers leverage today on the AWS connectors. It's basically, we've built frictionless on top of those connectors. With regards to your specific environment, though, it's probably best if you reach out to one of our SEs, your friendly SE or territory manager in your area, and ask that question directly. If you don't know who that is, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm g.millard@tenable.com, and I can route you through to the right person as long as you let me know where you are based, sir. So with that surprising few questions on the amount of people that we have available, I will give a few more moments. A couple of other announcements that we made that I didn't include in this presentation was the integration of Tenable OT, the operational technology, so ICS environments, into Tenable IO. So we announced Tenable SC integration when we made the acquisition of Indigi back in December last year, and we now have Tenable IO integrated into Tenable OT. So we now have a visibility of OT assets in IO. Rather interestingly, one of the other things that we didn't announce at Edge, but rolled out around about the same time, was the inclusion of Nessus in Tenable OT as well. So, if you look at an OT environment, about 50% of the assets within the OT environment are actually IT assets. And so by including Nessus, we can do very targeted scans of those IT assets to identify any vulnerabilities of them. So, when you're dealing with a converged environment, first off, you need a unified view, and we do that through SC or IO, and the on the OT environment side, we now have active assessment through native protocols, passive assessment if you have a zero-touch approach, and also we can leverage Nessus for those IT assets. So David, yes, I believe that was right. Somebody just whipped that off my screen, but David, yes, that is the right email address. Great. Oh, so Anthony asks, can we feed other sensor information into the AI engine to better infer asset comparisons, such as IPs being communicated with or volumes of traffic for specific ports and protocols? So great question, Anthony. Now, one of the really clever aspects of the asset exposure score is the inclusion of asset criticality rating. And we automatically calculate the asset criticality rating based on lots and lots of information that we gather on that asset. And that can be things like who it's communicating with, whether it's connected to the internet, routable through the internet, and what services are running on the device itself. Now, if you, for example, wanted to take your own information from your own environment and enrich the asset criticality rating with that, then you could do that. Most definitely, you probably want to do that through one of our APIs. But over time, what we're going to enable organizations to be able to do as well is actually use tags to tag an asset and affect the ACR based on the information on that tag itself. So as an example, if I tag an asset as Gav's critical assets, then increase the asset criticality by a factor of 1.5. So Carlos asks, in AWS, can you proactively detect a new EC2 from monitoring CloudTrail logs? Yes, we can, sir. In fact, you can do that today. So if you go into settings within IO, if you go into settings and connectors, you can set up an AWS connector and you can enable CloudTrail support there. And so you will automatically detect new assets as they come online through that CloudTrails integration. Now, furthermore, what you can actually do is then tag that asset with information, for example, whether it's been scanned or not, and then you can drive scanning to that asset based on those tags. Of course, with frictionless, as that's rolling out over the coming few weeks, you'll be able to leverage that capability to be able to assess automatically as well. So our cloud capabilities, risk-based vulnerability management for the cloud have dramatically improved with the addition of the cloud connectors that we released a year or so ago, and then with frictionless to actually identify the vulnerabilities that are present on those systems. And just a follow-up question there, will frictionless support native AWS tags? Yes, it does. In fact, as you're setting up the connector in frictionless, when it's rolled out to your environment, you actually tag the assets that you want to automatically assess via frictionless. So as an example, Gav's laptop, Gav's servers, all are tagged with AWS, native AWS tags. It actually indexes all the tags. I then be able to select it, and it'll automatically be included in that frictionless assessment. And so, as a customer, what you would be able to do is actually select those tags that you're interested in. I believe we're actually even going to be able to tell you how many assets that will include in those tags, and then it will automatically assess them and publish those vulnerabilities into your UI. Now, just a word of around licensing. The assets that you assess via frictionless are just like every other asset that you assess. So if you're assessing via frictionless and you assess 10 EC2 instances, that will just be 10 VM licenses. You don't have to come back to us for a new type of license, and it'll all be part of your base VM platform. So Amin asks, will frictionless work with GovCloud and also hybrid setups, or any setups required for these use cases? Amin, I am 98% sure that it will work with different setups like GovCloud and hybrid. But the best thing you can do is reach out to, excuse me, reach out to your SE or your TM, and they'll be able to give you clarity on that. My assumption is that it will be, but I don't want to give you a wrong answer. Anthony asks, with your asset criticality score, can you apply factors to the various data sources? For example, can I weigh an LDAP port higher than SSH? So we actually do all that calculation in the background. You can affect the score via tags, via the slider. So you can select lots of assets and say they are a 7 rather than a 5 at that fine grain level. And that is definitely something that we're looking at, but it isn't available today. But personally, it would be great. I think it'd be great if we could take that level of information. One of the things that we are bringing is the ability to tag based on plugin output. So you'd be able to assess an asset, understand the plugin output on a particular plugin, use that to tag, and then, as I said, use that tag to affect the asset criticality. So today, no, but we should be able to do that in the near future. Carlos asks, on AWS tags, will the reporting and dashboarding also be tag specific to give us a business context view? So yeah, a lot of the tag view is being rolled into dashboarding and reporting right now. And we actually made a major change to our dashboarding in IO over the last few weeks. And it enables us to be able to do exactly that type of reporting. With regard to actually leveraging the tags themselves, though, I believe that is being rolled out over the coming weeks rather than available today. Unfortunately, I can't look at my container right now, but I think it's going to be available rather soon. Again, whilst you're asking those questions, Carlos, to your TMRSE, include that one. I'm sure they'll give you visibility of when that rolls out. So with that, I appreciate all of you joining, especially in these unusual times. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to your SE or your territory manager, or alternatively, come to me. I'm gmillard@tenable.com. So, major changes that we're making to the platforms today that will really enable you to be able to see everything from cloud to OT, container to web app, predict what matters through vulnerability priority, through things like predictive scoring, and then act to address risk, through the metrics and measurements that we provide: cyber exposure score, asset maturity, assessment maturity, and remediation maturity. With that, thank you very much.